Kevin, welcome to the podcast, man. I'm really excited to talk to you about your new book and get to know you a little bit. So yeah, thanks for being here, man.
Thanks for having me, Emery. It's good to be here.
So you were saying before we started recording that this book, Walk in the Park, has been an effort over 6 years?
The writing of the book
took about
6 years. This is a book based on a hike that I did with a friend of mine starting in September of 2015 that involved hiking the length of Grand Canyon National Park and the Grand Canyon itself. And we started in September of that year, and it took about 14 months to finish the entire project. We weren't in the canyon for the entire time. We were down there for a total of about 75 days, spread out over the course of 8 back-to-back expeditions, each of which had a period of weeks or sometimes months between them, separating them. And then the process of writing the book took an additional 6 years after that.
With regard to the writing of the book, sometimes you hear people push out books, they whip them out, they do a thing, they whip them out. And then you talk to people like yourself that takes years and years and years to get a book done. Your process writing the book, why 6 years? Was it just the process of getting it all out, or what happened over those 6 years that before you were like, okay, yeah, I think it's good?
Well, I mean, I do this for a living, and I'm a very slow writer. Most of my book projects tend to take a number of years. I'd written one book on Grand Canyon before this. It was a book primarily about the river and the culture of whitewater boating at the bottom of the Grand Canyon. And that book, which is called The Emerald Mile, took the better part of a decade to put together and complete. Wow. So part of it is just the pace that I work at.
Yeah.
And part of the pace, there are a lot of writers out there who are much faster than I am, but narrative, long-form narrative nonfiction is a slow process. It requires a great deal of research and fact-checking when you're in the midst of it.
Yeah.
There's a lot of time that's spent acquiring the material and then working with material and shaping it into the form of a story and a narrative that makes sense. And then there's a lot of kind of messy trial and error that takes place as you just kind of wrestle with it. Mm-hmm. So I think there are a lot of writers out there who are better and smarter than me who probably could have done this book in half the time, but it's just the kind of the pace that I tend to work at.
That makes sense.
I wish I could do it faster, but it's kind of like the hike itself. It takes about as long as it's going to take.
Oh, interesting. Yeah, that's an interesting correlation. And I would imagine that after 6 years, or you probably have a bit of an emotional connection to this long-term project that is now coming to a close. Now that you're out on a book tour and everything.
I do. It is a journey on its own, a journey that unfolds, parallel to the hike itself. It's a journey of ideas and words and sentences that are strung together. Again, sort of like the footsteps that you take when you're moving physically from one end of the canyon to the other. And those two journeys unfold in parallel. And oddly enough, both of them are coming to an end. The book is about to make its debut next week. And that part of the journey will finally be over for me.
How's that feel?
At the moment, I'm a little too exhausted to really absorb how it feels, which is a lot. Which is not unlike how I felt at the end of our hike. There was a period of recovery that both my friend Pete McBride and I had to go through at the end of the hike before we were able to really take stock of the experience itself and try and figure out what it meant.
Oh. Do you have a history, before we dive into that, man, that's like a whole can of worms, right? Like what it meant, right? Do you have a history of doing these long duration, call it expedition things? Is that like in your DNA doing that kind of stuff?
So part of this story is that is the friendship between myself and this person we're talking about. His name is Pete McBride. He's a National Geographic photographer and filmmaker. And over the last 20 years, we have strung together a whole series of magazine assignments that have taken us all over the world, just in places that felt pretty exotic to both of us. We've gone all the way from the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge to the Horn of Africa and Everest Base Camp. And each and every one of those projects, each and every one of those magazine assignments was kind of a disaster. It involved getting in far over our heads, getting into a mess of trouble and having to figure out how to extract ourselves. And almost, I would say all of those projects really originated out of, Pete coming up with an ambitious but really bad idea, and then talking me into and seducing me into agreeing to participate in it, despite the knowledge that it was probably going to work out the way that the debacles that had preceded it had worked out. And I don't know if any of your listeners have, a friend in their lives a friendship that consists of one person, kind of getting the other into situations that he probably shouldn't be involved in the first place. But that's really the fulcrum of our friendship and our professional relationship. And so this hike through the Grand Canyon that you and I are talking about now, and this book that I just completed, that was really the culmination of many a litany of disasters that kind of unfolded over the years, and sort of culminated in the summer of 2015 when Pete came to me with what I think we would both agree now is the worst idea of all. That two inexperienced hikers who thought they knew the Grand Canyon, but really had no idea what they were getting themselves into, decided to embark on a project that was far beyond the scope of their abilities or knowledge, and how they kind of got their heads handed to them by the canyon and by the terrain and everything that unfolded after that. So Pete is kind of at the center of the story.
Is being humbled's not a bad thing. And it sounds like you guys have a knack for maybe being willing to be humbled in the past by situations. How do you find yourself? A lot of people will go into the backcountry or go on an adventure, they get humbled, and it's like game over. We're done here. But it sounds like you have a relationship with him in which you can bounce back from that. How did that come about?
Well, the bouncing back is not guaranteed by any means. And the process of getting spanked is something that always tends to feel final when it's happening. And that was certainly the case in our Grand Canyon adventure, or rather misadventure. We began this project dimly aware of the fact that there might be some challenges out there that might be a little bit beyond what we were truly capable of. But part of the problem, I think, arose from the fact that both Pete and I had a relationship with this landscape prior to the decision to try and hike the length of Grand Canyon. As I said, I'd written an entire book on the culture of whitewater guiding inside of Grand Canyon. In order to research that book, I'd spent the better part of a decade apprenticing myself as a river guide and acquiring the skills to handle a boat through the whitewater in the Grand Canyon, and listening to the stories and the oral history of the subculture of guiding down at the bottom of the canyon, getting to know the environment itself, the rock, the geology, the biology, the hydrology primarily, but really developing an understanding of what that place was. And so I emerged from that process having written this, whatever it was, like 416-page book, and I considered myself kind of an expert on Grand Canyon. And Pete, through a series of his own projects, which primarily involved chronicling the Colorado River, photographically and on film, he too had a feeling that he had a pretty good handle on this landscape. And so a part of the problem and part of our arrogance, I think, arose from this fundamental misunderstanding that we both had, that by virtue of having come to know what we regarded as the defining feature of the landscape itself, the Colorado River, the thing that was responsible for having carved and created and polished the Grand Canyon, we knew the canyon. And, it's kind of interesting to look back now because it's hard to overstate the magnitude of how diluted that is. What I didn't understand at the time is that, if any of your listeners have spent time on the Colorado River, if they know whitewater, if they know boating inside the Grand Canyon, they'll all kind of relate to this when I say that, there's very few things that feel as wild and untrammeled as a river, particularly if you're in a stretch of whitewater. And so if you're in a boat, if you're in an oar raft or a dory at the bottom of the Grand Canyon trying to navigate your way through a rapid like Hance or Lava Falls or Horn Creek, you feel that you're at the mercy of some of the wildest forces of nature, and you feel as if you're experiencing true wilderness. What I didn't understand fully at the time is that, that's true. That's very, very true. But what's also true, what's perhaps even more true, is that all that water that feels super wild inside the canyon, all of that energy, every drop of that river has been metered and rationed and is part of a incredibly intricate system of water containment and irrigation infrastructure that we've built up and down the length of this, the most important river in the Southwest. There's 19 dams, that are strung between the headwaters of the Colorado and the Sea of Cortez, or the part of the Sea of Cortez, the part of the desert, the Sonoran Desert that the river dries up in before it reaches the Sea of Cortez. It's been engineered. It's controlled. And furthermore, if anything goes wrong on the river, if you smash into a rock or somebody gets tossed out of a boat or there's a head injury, if you just sit there in about 2 or 3 hours, somebody's going to show up with a motor rig and they're going to have radios and they're going to have a med kit and they're going to have a bunch of people who know how to treat an injury, and they're going to be able to summon a helicopter to get you out if that's necessary. So what I didn't understand is that although the river, the thing that created the Grand Canyon, feels wild and free, it's not. It's plumbing. And if you want to experience the wilderness inside Grand Canyon, if you want to experience the terrain where human beings are not in charge, where you're not in charge, where you're at the mercy of forces that are far greater than anything that you can control, well, the borders of that zone begin, several yards off of your left and right oarlock. They start at the edge of the Colorado River, and they extend up through that matrix of cliffs and ledges, that vertical wilderness of rock that spans the stone walls of the canyon, all the way from the river to the rim. And that's the place where almost nobody goes. The river's the only highway through the canyon. The river's able to conduct about, 26,000 people a year who go down through the canyon by boat. Very few people step onto the shore and venture on foot into that other zone. Not the world of the rock, but the world of the water. Not the world of the water, but the world of rock.
Yeah.
And one of the most graphic testaments to how few people go there and how untrammeled it can be is that, the second most visited national park in the United States. The only place that sees more visitors in the national park system than Grand Canyon is Great Smoky Mountain National Park back east, which has a highway running through the middle of it. And Grand Canyon is the single most iconic of all of our parks. It's the park that, no matter whether you've been there or not, you will instantly recognize a photograph of that. So it's incredibly well known, and yet there's not a single trail that will conduct you from the eastern end of Grand Canyon at Lee's Ferry all the way through to the Grand Wash Cliffs in the west. So that is both a manifestation of and an embodiment, a symbolic representation of where the wilderness really lies inside of Grand Canyon. And I'm being incredibly long-winded here, but all of that is what I didn't really have a firm grasp of, despite having written an entire book on this landscape feature in this park. And that's what I was ignorant of and did not fully appreciate. And I think it fed a sense of arrogance that characterized the way I framed and approached the beginning of this journey when Pete and I embarked on it.
Man, that's a really interesting perspective. I haven't experienced the Grand Canyon much at all, aside from like maybe flying over it, I guess. It's one of those areas on the map that it's weird. It's like I almost have a odd high amount of respect for it that I'm afraid of going in there, not from like a safety standpoint, but I want to see the Grand Canyon for what the Grand Canyon is, if that makes sense. Like this wilderness area, this like the wildness of it, because just as an outsider looking in, I can totally see how, okay, we've established this river route through the Grand Canyon. There's some trails that go down into it and then out of it again. And there's people that tap into small portions of it. But often what you hear of is the canyon can humble you very quickly, even if you're on those routes. I have a couple buddies that traverse in and out of it. I don't know where they do it at. But the way they speak of it is very, look, do not go into this thing overly confident. And
I don't have enough breadth of experience in terms of, I assume that, a lot of your listeners are just incredibly experienced through hikers who, have been exposed to all kinds of trails and all kinds of terrain. I don't have that. So it's hard for me to kind of put my finger on and articulate what exactly it is about Grand Canyon that seems to place it into a category of its own when it comes to the challenges that it presents to people who want to move through it laterally on foot. But I think it has something to do with, it's interesting. Like if you talk to some of the backcountry rangers at Grand Canyon National Park, I mean, many of these people have been at other parks before they arrived at Grand Canyon. There are a number of them who have been at some really remote, huge parks up in Alaska. And two things they will tell you. The first is they'll tell you that even in Alaska, even at a place like, say, Wrangell, St. Elias in Alaska, the level of isolation that you can experience inside of Grand Canyon, despite the fact that like it's wedged between Las Vegas and, Flagstaff, it's not that far away from civilization, but the level of isolation and remoteness that you can feel in Grand Canyon can match that of a truly, truly remote park up in Alaska. And the other thing they'll say, and they just won't hesitate, when you ask them, like what's the toughest environment you can think of to hike inside of? And these are people who may have done like a traverse of, say, the Wind Rivers in Wyoming, right? And they'll be like, hands down, Grand Canyon, just no question. And I think it has something to do with the verticality of the terrain itself, that you're taking a desert and you're flipping it on its side and you're turning it into a vertical wilderness, a vertical desert. Yeah. And so you're combining the challenges of, and another way of thinking of Grand Canyon is you can think of it as a mountain range that is basically, suspended below the horizon. But it's very much like moving through the mountains, even though we think of it as a canyon. And so you combine the challenges of moving through a mountain environment and the challenges of moving through a desert environment simultaneously. All the the finding water and land navigation, and the demands that are being placed on your body in terms of endurance. And then you start adding weather and temperature to that. And it can be really, really brutal. And the consequences of mistakes can rise exponentially as a result of all of these factors. It's possible that some of your listeners hearing this are going to disagree and be able to point to all kinds of more extreme environments, the Grand Canyon. And I would willingly concede that, but this is what I hear from people who have spent their lives in the Park Service. And it certainly was borne out in terms of my own experience inside that place.
Yeah. Man, that's fascinating. How long did it take you to realize, like when you stepped outside that barrier of, you talk about, the wilderness starts a few meters off your oarlock. When was your first wake up session or come to Jesus session within the outside that boundary of the river? Do you recall like your first moment of being like, whoa, okay, this was not what I expected?
Well, I'd love to be able to tell you that it started like 5 minutes after leaving the parking lot. But the really embarrassing fact is that, it started the night before we actually embarked on our hike. So Outside Magazine has just released an excerpt of this book. It just dropped on their website yesterday. And, I was really thrilled to hear that they were going to excerpt an entire chapter of the book and share it with their readers, until I realized, and I probably should have seen this coming, that they selected the most humiliating and embarrassing chapter in the entire book. And it chronicles what happened when Pete and I left Flagstaff on a Saturday afternoon in late September and drove ourselves up to an area on the east rim of the Grand Canyon, not far from Lee's Ferry, where we were supposed to meet this crew of very experienced thru-hikers who we had fast-talked into permitting us to kind of accompany them, to shadow them on what would be the first leg of our sectional thru-hike, and was the first section of their continuous thru-hike. And so they had agreed to kind of chaperone us through the first 63 or 64 river miles of the canyon, down through what's known as Marble Canyon. And Pete and I showed up after dark and opened up the tailgate of my truck, excuse me, and all of the boxes from, REI and Patagonia and Black Diamond and Feathered Friends that contained the gear that we had ordered and we were supposed to have opened up and tested weeks before, tumbled out of the truck. And we found ourselves fumbling around to get our headlamps on and start to kind of sort and arrange everything. This gives you an idea of not just how clueless we were, but how poorly we had prepared for this. We were both incredibly busy at the time. I was trying to finish a book. Pete was trying to finish a film, but that's really no excuse for, failing to kind of do the homework in terms of getting your gear dialed. Mm-hmm. And so this kind of like clown fest ensued. And we spent the next several hours, unboxing our like camp stove and trying to screw on our gas canisters and cut the price tags off of our, odor-free underwear. And you can probably imagine how badly it went from there. When we finally weighed our packs, I think I came in at right around 53 pounds and Pete was at about 55. We had all this equipment, tape recorders and cameras. He had a backup camera. He had a backup tripod. He had 2 solar banks for all of his batteries. I mean, this is how we typically travel when we're on assignment. And we'd made no accommodation for the fact that we were going to be carrying all this stuff on our backs through a desert environment in, 100-degree heat for the next 2 or 3 weeks.
Yeah.
And these experienced hikers who kind of stood there and watched this farce unfold were just dumbfounded by what they were witnessing. And I've tried to write about that as honestly as possible, despite that it's pretty embarrassing, because it's it's indicative of the mindset with which we started, and it's indicative of the journey that we would need to complete mentally just to get to the place we needed to be to start the hike in a proper frame of mind. And from that night, over the next, it took the canyon about 5.5 days to break us in half. The next 5.5 days were just an absolute sufferfest as we stumbled through. It was a unseasonal kind of early autumn heat wave. Temperatures were 105 degrees at night, pushing past 115 in the day. Our companions were carrying 33, 34, 35 pounds, so we were carrying far more than they were. Feet were covered in blisters, kept falling down and getting injured. Pete eventually began to suffer the effects of hyponatremia because we weren't hydrating properly. I mean, it just went downhill from there. And it was humiliating and brutal and awful. And when we finally arrived at the conclusion that we just couldn't take it anymore and we had to pull the ripcord and just get out of the canyon and abandon the hike, we thought we were abandoning not just the first leg of the hike, but the whole project. We came out of the canyon convinced that we had been spanked so badly for sins that extended far back into the past, because the way we had approached the canyon was the way we had approached all these other magazine assignments in the past. And we'd gotten away with it for so many years, just skating on incredibly thin ice. And finally, we'd gotten ourselves into an environment that just would simply not allow us to cut the corners that we had cut in the ways that we had so often over so many years. And we returned to Flagstaff with our tails between our legs, convinced that the project was over and the assignment was over, because this was an assignment for National Geographic. And we were convinced we were going to have to call up our editors in Washington, D.C. and basically tell them if they wanted the project finished, they were going to have to, outsource it to a couple of college students from Flagstaff, because we didn't have the wherewithal to complete it. It was pretty bad.
How did you go from that to entering back into the canyon?
Well, the way that happened was just a miracle occurred, or at least it felt like one at the time. I think another thing that we did not fully understand is that there is a small but very, very passionate community of people who are connected to the canyon. And, I knew a lot of them through the boating world, but I didn't know any of the hikers and the backpackers. But what all of these people share in common is a deep sense of passion for the landscape, for the park, and a desire to protect it, and an understanding of how vulnerable it is, how fragile it is, how much damage can be done to it by development projects, despite the fact that, as I said earlier in this conversation, this is our second most visited and most well-known national park. It's a place that we think of as sacrosanct and inviolable by virtue of its status as the crown jewel of America's national park system. And yet, like all of our parks, like all of our public lands, it's incredibly vulnerable. And so these people really care about this landscape. And what we didn't know was happening was that the experienced hikers who looked after us and basically kept us alive during those 5.5 days when we were getting driven into the dirt, that, they reached out using their satellite communications gear after we pulled out of the canyon and contacted a number of folks in Flagstaff who are part of the hiking and backpacking community, and basically said, look, there are these two idiots from National Geographic who are trying to complete an assignment, which is partly intended to showcase some of the development threats that loom over the Grand Canyon. And they need to complete their project, and you guys need to help them. And so when Pete and I came back to Flagstaff, and we were just kind of in recovery mode, these folks reached out to us. We were given a dinner invitation. We showed up at one of their houses, and we were basically told that we were going to be put through a kind of like a hiking makeover program, an extreme hiking makeover program. And over the course of the next 6 weeks, like they just redialed everything. They would show up at my house. I live in Flagstaff. Pete lived up in Colorado, but he was staying with me. And so they would show up at the house and they'd dump our backpacks out onto the living room floor and they'd start throwing things away. And then they'd start carefully replacing those things with other things that made a lot more sense. And so they rebuilt the contents of our packs. Then they took a look at our nutrition program and our meals and began to redesign those. And then we took a look at the maps and started to redesign the routes and design them in a way that made sense in terms of our ability and our fitness, which was not all that great either. And at the end of that process, they kind of announced that they were going to be going back into the canyon with us as kind of like minders and babysitters almost, and help to pull us through the canyon so that we could photograph and write about the landscape, the threats that loom over the park, and they hoped tell the larger story of all of it, what it is, what's in danger of damaging it, and why it matters. And after the hike was completed, Pete built an entire documentary film. He did 3 coffee table photo books. We've done a lecture circuit all around the country through National Geographic. But this book, which is about to be published, is the final piece of the puzzle. It represents the culmination of the commitment that we made to the people who sacrificed in order to help pull us through the canyon and ensure that we could witness and understand and connect with what made this place unique and makes this place special and makes it matter. And then try to tell, the one thing that we do know how to do. I mean, look, let's face it, we suck as far as super experienced long distance hikers and backpackers. But our business is storytelling. That's what we do. And what these people wanted was to enable us to be able to do what we have trained to do and what we're meant to do. And so, so this is the final piece of the puzzle in attempting to do that. It'll be interesting to see. Once you finish a book and hand it over to the world, you're no longer in control of it, and you no longer get to judge whether it's good or bad. That judgment is rendered by everybody else. So I will have the opportunity to step back and allow others to decide whether I've done that badly or well. But it'll be interesting to see what unfolds from here.
Did you expect to uncover such a community in that backpacking world? Like, I know that you'd probably experienced it in the river side. So it's probably a no-brainer that it would exist on the backpacking side, but
not necessarily. I mean, it's a really good question. It kind of made me think for a moment because nobody's ever asked me that. And I guess my answer to you is, I'm not sure. I expected it from the river world, but I thought it was a hallmark of the river world.
Yeah.
There's this kind of like generosity and openness, and like everybody always gives each other hugs, and there's this warmth that pervades the river community. And I've always thought of backpackers as people who have a kind of a harder edge to themselves. They carry themselves in a different way. They have to endure a lot more suffering and pain and hardship physically and I would say mentally too.
Yeah.
I mean, every boatman and whitewater person who hears me say this is gonna object, but it's true. It's like, if you're a river person, like if you work as a river guide, you get to live on a boat, and you get to carry, everything that you would want plus more. An entire cook setup, gas canisters, pillows, beer. I mean, it all goes down the river with you. And if you're a hiker, if you're a backpacker, like you're somebody who has accepted the proposition that you must pare down what you own and what you carry to what you're able to schlep on your back over incredibly difficult terrain. And you give up almost everything that stands that softens the boundary between you and wilderness. You don't get to have a beer at the end of the day. You don't get to be warm at night, and there's a whole bunch of things that you don't get to be that you get to enjoy on the river if you're a backpacker. So I thought of hikers as harder people, less generous people.
Yeah.
People who aren't as nice and aren't as open as the river community. And so to the extent that I was surprised by the reaction that we experienced, your question is really a good one. I haven't thought about this ever. Yeah, I was surprised because they, oh my God, they just embraced us.
Yeah.
With everything and more that I had witnessed on the river community. And I have to say too that, I think that the manner in which we were embraced by them, we were taken under their wing, we were protected by them.
Yeah.
Part of it arose from a quality of what I'm talking about here, a quality of openness, a quality of generosity, an aspect of altruism. But part of it was much more calculated. These people were helping us because they thought, rightly or wrongly, that by helping us, they were helping the larger cause or protecting the larger welfare of the landscape itself. It was a bet they made. Yeah. We help these guys, they might help this place. Yeah. There was a quid pro quo aspect to it. Yeah. And that doesn't diminish my appreciation and reverence for who they are and what they did for us. That sense of indebtedness and gratitude that I feel towards them, towards each and every person who helped us, as well as the larger community to which they belonged, it's as deep as the canyon itself.
Yeah.
Those two things, I think, can totally coexist. Yeah. Acknowledging that there was a calculus involved, and also saying that I just, they're very, very endearing people, and I'll remain connected to them forever by what they did for us.
That's incredible. Yeah, when you brought that up, it kind of gave me chills a little bit, and it made me. I was actually feeling quite a lot of things when you were talking about these individuals gathered around and gave you a shakedown. And I say that because it made me very proud, because I've seen it with my own two eyes, and I've received that love from people that on the outside you're like, it seems like they have no reason to do this. They have this skill set that, yeah, you'd think that these people are hardened, and that it's well, you'll figure it out. It's on you. When in reality, if you allow them the opportunity, and yes, I probably so, like, they have a connection to this environment. They have they're connected to it somehow, some way, spiritually connected to it. So they see an opportunity to help someone who's trying to help them in a way. But what you described was something that happens throughout the thru-hiking community, probably every single day of the thru-hiking seasons, because there's these experienced individuals who offer this knowledge, and they help trim down the fat, because they know that what if they can help you, that it's going to be better for you. They know what's coming for you, not in a bad sense, but they know in what a good sense. Like they know what's coming down for you. Like if you don't get this right, you'll never see the result. And so if they can
Mhm.
help you get there and help you along the way, they know that in your case, they know that this book will occur and this noise will get out there, and maybe, conservation efforts come of it. But in like, say, a hiker on the PCT, they know that it's going to be good for you long term if you make it to Canada, and it's bad for you, not bad for you, but it's not as good for you if you don't, like they don't want you to leave the trail associated with this bad mentality of like, oh, through hiking's terrible. This is awful. But when they can just tweak you a little bit and like love on you. And there's like this massive community in the through hiking world where it's nothing but love. And it's the strangest thing that, on the outside, you think these people are hardened. But at the same time, they're very soft. So I'm so, that makes me so happy for you that you got to experience just being overwhelmed with here's what you're doing wrong. Here's what you can do right.
No, no, it was. I mean, it was great. It was transformative. It also taught me something important, which I hadn't understood beforehand. I mean, I'm not a through hiker, and I can't speak to the culture of through hiking and the PCT or the Continental Divide Trail, the Appalachian Trail that you're talking about. But I can tell you that, based on what Pete and I experienced in Grand Canyon, I came away with a fundamentally altered view of, I'm trying to think of how to frame this, of like the nature of what it means to experience wilderness. And to
Yeah.
explain that, I think I need to back up for a second. So I think, and there are a lot of people out there who might disagree with this, which they're welcome to do. I, I, I think that as a culture, we have been um, encouraged and in some ways programmed to frame the idea of wilderness as a solitary experience.
Mm.
It's part of how we think about wilderness. It's part of how our great wilderness writers have written about it.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it goes all the way back to Daniel Boone and
Yep.
Henry David Thoreau, and you think about these iconic figures in the history of American wilderness, and they're usually moving through and confronting wilderness in a state of being alone. And I think many people in the world that I was part of for many years when I worked as an editor at Outside Magazine have been encouraged to think of achievement in the outdoors as something that is largely a solitary thing. You're pushing your goals and extending the boundaries of what you think is possible for you.
Yep.
Maybe you're doing it with some help from some other people, but you're going to calibrate and measure the achievement itself by whether you stood on top of that mountain or
Yeah.
you were able to establish the fastest known time on this trail or whatever. And what our experience in Grand Canyon taught me, among many, many other things, is that there's another way of looking at this. It opened me to the idea that there's an awful lot to be gained by moving into and through and connecting with wilderness in a state of being alone. And there's a lot to be said for solitude and the opportunity that it offers for contemplation and recharging and renewal and introspection. But the way I experienced through hiking Grand Canyon was as a communal effort. It was an expression of community. Without that community, Pete and I never would have made it beyond the first leg of the journey.
Yeah.
And once I realized and acknowledged that, it kind of opened the door for me to consider something else, which is that, this hike has made me think a lot about not just this one national park that I'm particularly attached to, but all of our national parks, which I think of as one of our greatest treasures as a nation. I'm not someone who thinks of himself as particularly patriotic,
Mhm.
but I'm quite patriotic when it comes to the idea of how the efforts we've made, imperfect and otherwise, to
Yeah.
preserve wilderness and to pass it along intact or as close to intact as possible to future generations of Americans, and the covenant that we uphold among ourselves to, to fulfill those obligations. And
Mm.
so I, I, I've always thought that our national park system is this incredibly cool opportunity to go out and have solitary experiences. But what I now think is that that's just, for me, not the right way to think of it, because I think some of the most profound rewards, some of the most profound experiences that are available to us as citizens of this country on our public lands is by going into and moving through them with people we love.
Yeah.
And that what these spaces do, in addition to whatever insights and epiphanies and physical transformations that they may create inside of us as we confront their challenges, more than that, they strengthen and enrich and deepen the bonds that hold us together,
Yeah.
that hold those of us who care about one another or care about one another by virtue of the fact that we have this space that we care about between us.
Yeah.
You think about our national parks and like how people go to them. I mean, I think the people who get the most out of them, and I'm not knocking the idea of going out and doing things alone, but like when I encourage people to go to national parks, I encourage people to go with their families.
Yeah.
That's what we do. We go into these spaces with people we love,
Yeah.
and we come out of them. Almost always, not always, but almost always, we come out of them bonded in
Yeah.
ways that are stronger and more meaningful. And that is a service that they give to us and that we don't really acknowledge fully. And I think that's one of the things that I learned from this journey and the community of people who reached out and embraced us and enabled us to get from one end of Grand Canyon to the other.
How do you think that changes your perspective on conserving these places and protecting them? Or does it?
That's another good question. I'll tell you a small story that's in the book. So this book that I just finished, over the course of this journey that Pete and I embarked on, my father had prostate cancer, was in the process of dying. And Pete and I had committed to this assignment. And as we were moving through the canyon, when we would come out of the canyon, I would have to go back home and help care for my dad as he moved through the final stages of
Yeah.
his battle with cancer. But right at the start of our hike, he was scheduled to go in for a huge round of chemotherapy, and his oncologist sat the whole family down and said to my dad, if there's a place you want to go to, if there's an experience that you want to have with your family, do it now. Do it before the chemo starts. And what he was saying, in effect, was, this is your last opportunity. So we talked to my dad. We asked him where he wanted to go, and there was no question in his mind what he wanted to see. He'd never seen Grand Canyon before. This place that I had devoted a portion of my life to, and been an apprentice river guide inside of, written a whole book about. So we set up this whole, family vacation. We drove almost all the way around the entire perimeter of the canyon, and he got to see it from the rim. And took him down to Lease Ferry so that he could, let the Colorado River run through his fingers. We took him up to the kaibab so he could see the aspen leaves and hear the owls hooting in the trees. But one of the things that was the most memorable for me was his first look at the canyon. And it was on the south rim at a place called Lippin Point, which may or may not be familiar to people who are listening to this podcast, but it's just a little bit west of Grandview, along the south rim. And it doesn't attract typically a huge number of visitors. But one reason why I wanted him to see it is that, you can look out from Lippin Point. You can see a decent stretch of the river, which isn't always guaranteed from the South Rim, but you can also see the Palisades of the desert. You can see where the Little Colorado River Gorge is coming in, and you can see that immense bend that the canyon makes as it switches from a north to south axis and bends to the west. And it's very dramatic, and you can look out and you can actually see, among many other things, you can see a portion of the east rim of the canyon along the Navajo reservation where there was a proposal at the time to build a giant tramway. There were a group of developers from Phoenix who wanted to put in a resort and a tram that would go from the top all the way to the confluence of the Little Colorado River and the Colorado River, one of the most sacred places inside of Grand Canyon. And they were going to build a raised metal walkway and an amphitheater and a restaurant. And so I realized when we got to Lippin Point that I could see this where this tramway was going to go in. As I was kind of looking out there, I realized also that the rest of the family, just immediately without really talking to anybody, they just all headed down the first part of the trail there. It's the start of one of the trails that leads down to the river. And so my nephews and my brother and my mother and my sister-in-law all disappeared down the trail. And I was expecting my dad to go down, and my dad said he was not going to do this. His physical condition had deteriorated to the point where he didn't feel it was safe to even walk down the trail. So he just sat himself down on the stone wall. And I was sitting there, I was looking out at this tramway, this area where the tramway was going to be proposed. And I asked him, I was like, Dad, if there was a cable car system here, would you be interested in it? Would it help someone like you? And the reason I asked him was because I'd been very dismissive of this tram. I figured it was an abomination. It was a violation of a fundamental set of rules that governed how we should treat a place like the Grand Canyon. But then here was my dad, who was ill and elderly and incapacitated and coming to the canyon for the very first time and laying eyes on it. And he could not even complete the simple act of following his family a few steps down into the canyon. And I was fully prepared to hear him say, yeah, I would really appreciate that. And I was fully prepared to have to then perhaps rethink my own position.
Rewire the brain, yeah.
By virtue of this new perspective that my dad, as he's in the process of dying, was kind of handing to me. And that would have been like this, beautiful and important moment of transition in terms of my thinking about the canyon. But that's not what he said. What he said was, hell no. And I was like, well, why not? And he said, well, of course I wouldn't want a tramway because of them. And he was pointing down the trail to where my family had disappeared. And I realized only later that my dad was pointing down the trail, but he wasn't pointing at my mom or my brother or my sister-in-law. He was pointing towards his grandchildren. And he was pointing towards his understanding, right or wrong, his belief, right or wrong, that putting something like a tramway, bolting a tramway to the sides of the Grand Canyon would diminish the world that his grandchildren were about to inherit. And what he was unwilling to do was he was unwilling to allow something like that to be put into the canyon so that he could be permitted to experience the bottom of a Grand Canyon, but at the expense of the world that was being handed to his grandchildren. So you asked a moment ago about whether this journey affected the way I think about conservation. And I think about it now in a way that my dad taught me to think about it in that moment. I evaluate landscape and the things that it offers and the sacrifices that are needed in order to protect it and hand it off intact, less in terms of what I'm going to get out of it in my lifetime, and more in terms of what I need to do in order to fulfill the covenant that by virtue of existing before I arrived allows me to experience these places. I don't know if that makes sense, but what I'm trying to say is that I I spend more time thinking about what I owe to these places and less time thinking about what I can get out of them.
Yeah.
And that has changed my relationship with them a little bit. And that was a super long-winded story for which I apologize. But
I love it.
You know, that's an example of something I learned during the hike.
I love that. No, I'm grateful for that entire story, and I find that fascinating. Your father sounds like a great man, a very wise man, who just knew that it wasn't about him all the time. That there was a bigger game to be played. And man, it's so interesting that you went through this experience. Sounds like, quite the trial and tribulation. You came out on the other side. Clearly, it wasn't a detriment to your life. It had probably enhanced it, at least, taught you some things along the way. And here you are with, these opinions now, and these, whether they're more formulated than what they were, but you're better for it. And it just makes me wonder, what if the national parks and the places we have conserved were for, on the surface, maybe it was just for a wilderness experience. And, because they're beautiful, Yellowstone and Yosemite and all these different places. But what if what if they end up being the one thing that like brings society back together and like connects society back together somehow? Like, to your point earlier about, you used to think that wilderness was a solo experience because that's what they taught us. What if it's the thing that brings us back together, though, in a community? Because you experienced the river community, right? And you've experienced the thru-hiking community. And there's all these people, these different communities, the hunting community, the fly fishing community. There's all these communities out there. And the one thing they have in common is like this love for these wild spaces. And a lot of them, they do them alone, but a lot of them do it with people that they love. And if you ask them if they would prefer to do it alone or with the person that they love, I mean, that's one of the big takeaways I had from hiking the PCT, man, was I got to the end of it and I thought to myself, if I did this again, I would want to do it with those that I love the most.
Yeah, you want to share those experiences with the people you care about. And I think you're, I mean, powerful landscapes do have the potential to bring people together. It's not one thing that's going to bring us back together, but it could be a component of a bunch of different things. It doesn't speak to everyone, but it can speak to a surprising number of people, particularly children, particularly young people who get to have the privilege of experiencing it at an age when they're impressionable. And what they do is this gets back to my dad in a way too, because one thing I didn't mention was, my dad, this wasn't a big part of who he was, but I think it rested pretty close to the center of who he was. My dad was a Marine, or he was not a career Marine, but he was a Marine. Mm-hmm. And one of the ways that being a Marine marks you, I think, is that it imposes a set of values that orient you towards service of others, towards service of something beyond yourself. You could probably make an argument that every branch in the military does this. And I say this as someone who, I'm not in the military. I've never been in the military. I don't have any connection to it, nor should I be speaking for or on behalf of it. But this is my impression of part of who my dad was. And that ties back to these landscapes in the sense that one thing that a landscape like Grand Canyon can do is, just by virtue of being so much larger and more complicated than we are, it's able to render us small enough as individuals and as a society that it delivers the message that we don't really matter. It lifts us out of the set of delusions that you and me and everybody listening to this podcast carries around in our pocket every day, all day long, which is that, like, we matter a lot.
Yeah.
Our voices matter. The noise and shock and awe that we create as we like drive through the neighborhood or go about our lives, the significance of who we are and what we create and the impact of it all, that like it really, really matters. And one of the insights and messages that, nature and wilderness and spaces in our national parks in part that is that like none of that is true. Actually don't matter that much.
Mm-hmm.
And it's really refreshing.
Yeah.
And necessary, I think, because humbleness and humility it's kind of a bedrock value. You can build a lot of things on that, and they're going to last a lot longer than a foundation that's built on arrogance. And maybe in a way, that's what I'm doing in this book, is I'm illustrating how Pete and I had to get stripped down to the bedrock by the canyon just in order to begin the process, just in order to be open to learning some of the lessons and benefiting from some of the insights that a landscape like this can offer.
Man, I love that. Oh, man. I'm as much as I hate to hear that you had a hard time, I love to hear that you had a hard time. Because it's true. Like the more stripped down you get,
yeah.
It is what it is. It helps. And to come out of that, I'm grateful that you guys started this thing. Just from an overall perspective of the impact on, clearly, your book is going to have an impact on someone, and probably a lot of someones. And I'm grateful and thankful that a person like yourself would dedicate the time, the emotional and physical energy, and to such an incredible idea, and see it through to the end. And then not only that, but like spend the time putting it together. Like in a world where people just want to pump stuff out and get on to the next thing, I find so much more value in slowing down and doing it the right way. And man, congratulations on the book. That's incredible.
Well, thanks, man. It's been a pleasure talking to you.
Yeah. To tell people about the book, you said as of recording of this, it's not yet out, but it's going to be out by the time this recording goes out. But it's A Walk in the Park. Is there anything else you'd want people to know about the book before they get their grubby little hands on it?
Well, it's called A Walk in the Park, the true story of a spectacular misadventure in the Grand Canyon. It's published by Scribner, comes out on May 28th. And there's an author tour. I'll be traveling all over the Intermountain West. And if you're interested in hearing me speak or getting a book signed, if you go to my website, kevinfedarko.com, there's an itinerary of the author tour. Other than that, I have nothing to say. The book speaks for itself.
It's all in here.
It's all on its own merits.
Yeah.
And I having put it into the world, I now commend it into the hands of others to be celebrated or rejected or dismissed. We'll see what happens.
Yeah.
And whatever it is will be okay.
I love it. Are you coming to the Portland area at all?
I'd love to be able to come up to Portland sometime next year when the paperback comes out. So I'm very much hoping for that.
Well,
yes.
If you're in the area, that's where I'm just north of Portland. So consider yourself having a friend in the area.
Thank you.
Kevin, thank you so much. I appreciate your time. I know you're on a whirlwind of an adventure with the book, and I wish you the best of luck. Thank you so much for taking the time to talk. And this is like the perfect conversation for me and the audience. My audience really appreciates, the fun stories, but like what comes of that and like, what does it all mean? And I think the more we can push that on people like, hey, really reflect on this stuff. Like, what does this all mean? And I'm sure that you could probably talk at length about that. And I feel like we just scrubbed the surface, and I'm really excited to read your book, man.
Well, thank you so much. Thanks for the great questions, Emery. And I hope it gives you some good material for your podcast, and I wish you all the best.